Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 4 player game Skymines, being released by Deep Print Games and Pegasus Spiel. Now in this game, players play investors who are trying to earn the most money by investing and influencing certain companies who are mining resources from the moon. And there's an interesting card selection, action selection mechanic in this game where players will be able to choose what actions they take and resolve them in certain orders to take certain actions. There are also bonus spaces where players can place their bonus markers to take worker placement actions. How does the game play? Well, let's get to the table and find out. Skymines comes with all of the components that you see here, including 4 double-sided player boards, 5 double-sided company tracks, a double-sided game board, a score pad, 10 starting research tokens, 6 special research plans, 72 total research plans separated into A, B, and C tiles, a number of different overview sheets, 60 crypt coin tokens in 1s and 5s, 8 on and off markers, 4 bonus tiles, a first player marker, 19 Luna cards and 4 Luna tokens, 4 upload markers, 4 helium-3 markers, player components in the 4 different player colors, 4 single energy cards, 5 track cards, 44 action cards separated into different decks A through E, 60 outposts and 20 shuttles for the 4 different companies in the game, 6 mission cards, and 6 threat cards. The game also comes with 6 different tuck boxes that can be constructed to help store the components in a more organized way. To begin setup, place the board in the middle of the table. Then you'll take the company tracks and place them around the board. For the first game, it's recommended that you take A1, B1, C1, and D1 and place them near these company tracks as indicated. Then cover each home space of each company with outposts of the matching color. Next, you'll construct the action deck by first sorting each of the action cards by their different letter. Then start by shuffling the letter E cards and placing them as a face-down stack, and then shuffle and place each stack of cards in reverse order on top of this. So for instance, stack D, then C, B, and finally stack A. After you've done this, fill in all of the empty cards on the display, starting from number 1 and then going in ascending order, ending with number 12. Once this has been done, it should look something like this. Then place the crypt coins near the board as a supply. In the top right corner of the board, you'll need to set up the research display by following these steps. First, place 1 coin from the supply on the supplement space, and then 1 coin onto each of the round track spaces numbered 2 through 7, making sure to leave space number 1 open. Then you'll take the 6 special research plan tokens and place them face down on top of each of the coins in ascending order from 2 to 7. Then separate the other research plans by the letter on their backs, shuffle them, and then place them as separate stacks face down next to the spaces of the board that match their letter. Then fill in each empty space with plans from the appropriate letter stack. Place the 4 bonus tiles next to the bottom right side of the game board. Then each player will choose a player color and take the appropriate game piece of that color. They'll then take a player board and place it in front of them, and then place their player token in the computer screen in the top left of the player board. Then take the helium-3 marker and place it on the first space of the tank track. Place the 2 on-off markers on the farthest left and right space in the off orientation. Collect the upload marker and place it near the player board. Each player would collect 1 coin from the reserve. Then each player would take a number of bonus markers in their player color depending on the player count. Next, each player will take the 4 track markers of their color and place them onto the 0 space of each of the 4 company tracks. Next, each player will find and collect the 9 starting cards with their player symbol in the top right corner. And if players find it helpful, they can also collect an overview sheet and place it near the play area as well. Then determine a starting player and give them the start player marker. Next, you'll give each player in turn order their specific single energy card. The first player would receive the card with 1, second player would receive the 2, 3, 4, etc. This will make it so that each player has 10 cards in their hand. Then each player will receive a starting research token. In your first play, the rulebook recommends giving the following tokens to the respective players. In future games, once you know how to play a bit better, each player can be given 2 tokens and pick one and discard the other. Once each player has their starting research token, they'll place it on the starting screen of their research track right here. Players will then search their hand for the 3 cards that match these 3 icons. So in this example, these 3 cards. And then those cards can be placed in any order in the 3 central resting spots at the top of their player board. And then players will gain their starting bonus from their research tile. Each of these starting bonuses will refer to a specific track that the players get to move up on to start the game. For instance, this bonus allows this player to move up 3 spaces on the Skymines resources track. So after completing this, their starting bonus would allow them to be here, whereas the other player would allow them 2 spaces on the Minerva Corporation. There are also certain bonuses that might allow you to move up on your tank track by moving this marker as well. After each player has gained their bonus, they'll place their upload marker on the left half of their starting research token, and then you're ready to play. In Skymines, the goal of the players is to earn the most money by investing in one of the 4 different companies and spreading those companies' influence out along the board. Players will take actions during the game to place outposts out along the board to claim benefits. This will increase the value for each share of the respective company. For instance, by uncovering these 4 coin icons, this means that each share of this company is worth 4 coins at the end of the game. And if a player has reached this space on the track, they've unlocked 3 shares, so at the end of the game, they would have 3 times 4 points. Players can also claim cards that will give additional shares at the end of the game, so instead of just having 3 shares, this player would have 4. Players can also earn points for how far they've gotten on their tracks on their player board, and we'll look at that in more detail later in the video. A game of Skymines is played over 7 total rounds, and each round will consist of 3 phases. The first phase of each round is the planning phase, and this is carried out by all players simultaneously. First, players will select cards from their hand that they want to play in the current round, and place them face down below their available action spaces on their player board that say On. It's important to note that players are allowed to place fewer cards than they have slots available if they want, and players can place cards in whichever slots they want as well. At the start of the game, each player has 3 available action slots, but later in the game, by traveling on certain tracks, they can unlock additional action slots, which will allow them to play more cards on their turn. We'll look at how to do that in more detail later. After all players have decided which cards they want to plan, all of the cards would be flipped face up. Then the planning phase would be over. After the planning phase, it would then be the action phase, where players would take turns, either activating their cards to take actions one at a time, or by placing their markers on action spaces on the main board. On a player's turn, they'll take exactly 1 action. Like I said, some actions require using cards, while some actions require placing bonus markers on the board. After a player has taken an action that uses a card, they would flip that card, or cards, depending on the action, face down, and then it would be the next player's turn in turn order. Play would continue in this way until each player has taken the drop out of the action phase action, which is essentially passing on their turn. Now that we've talked about the basic structure of an action phase, let's look at each of the actions that you can take in detail. The first action that a player can take is using 1 or more cards of a single resource type in their play area. So for instance, by taking this action, this player could either spend 2 carbon and then end the action, or they could spend 1 carbon and end the action, or they could spend 3 carbon and use all the cards at once. It's important to note that if this player had played these 2 resources instead of resources of the same type, when taking this action they would only be able to spend 2 resources on one turn, and then they would have to use the other 2 resources on a future turn. When taking this action to use resources, players can do one of 2 things. They can either spend the resources to acquire new cards from the display, or they can spend the resources to advance on a company track. If a player uses resources to acquire a card, they have to pay the total cost indicated on the card and on the space where the card is located. So for instance, to purchase this card, the player would have to pay 2 plus 0 additional resources for a total of 2. If a player wanted to purchase this card for their deck, they would have to pay 1 for the card and 1 additional resource for the space. And if a player wanted to purchase this card, they would have to pay 2 plus 1 for a total of 3. And as you can see, the cards become more expensive the further left you go in the display. So in our example, if the player had spent all 3 of their available resources, they could purchase this card and have 1 resource left over. It's important to note that when you're buying cards from the display, you can only ever purchase 1 card per action. And the card display isn't refilled until the end of the round. If you have any resources left over after buying a card, you can spend any remaining resources to advance 1 space on any company track for each resource you have left. So for instance, with their 1 leftover resource, this player could move up 1 space on this track, and they could have chosen any other track to advance on if they wanted to. After buying a card from the display, it would be added directly to the player's hand. Instead of acquiring a card, players can use resources on their turn to move up on 1 or more company tracks. So for instance, if this player had spent their 3 resources and didn't want to acquire a card, they could move up 3 spaces on 1 track or 1 space on 3 different tracks. You can split this movement however you want, and when doing this action, you move 1 space forward per resource value that you spend. After using resources to either acquire a card or move up on company tracks, or both, you would flip any resource cards used on that turn face down, and then it would be the next player's turn. Instead of using resource cards on their turn, player could use all of the energy cards in their area. If players choose to take this action, they have to use all of their energy cards. So for instance, if the player had planned these cards on their turn, they would have to use both of these cards to take this action. When taking this action, the player will add up all the values on their energy cards to get a total energy value. So in this instance, they would have a value of 3. Players would then spend this energy value to expand the company's influence out on the board. Players would first have to choose a company. So in this instance, the teal player chooses the Minerva Corporation. And then that player could spend their energy points to take stations off of the appropriate company section and place them out in different sectors of the moon. The sector that you enter has to either be adjacent to the company's station or to any other sector that already contains an outpost. So for instance, if the board looked like this, a player could expand either into this section or any of these sections as they're adjacent to sections that are already controlled by this company. When taking outposts from a station, you have to select the topmost outpost from a column. So if a player wanted to select an outpost to remove from this station, they would have to choose one of these 3 outposts. Uncovering the bottommost outpost on a column will yield the most rewards for this particular company, so it's usually advisable to empty a column as quickly as you can, although there may be situations when you choose to take a different strategy. When entering a new region, it will either cost 1, 2, or 3 energy points depending on the type of region you're moving into. To cross over a single line into a region, like going right here, it would only cost 1 energy point. If you want to cross over a double line, however, it would cost 2 energy points. So for instance, crossing over into this section would cost this player 2 energy points, since they've crossed a double line. You can also enter regions with other station outposts, but it would cost an additional energy to enter a region like that. So for instance, it would cost a player 3 total energy to move 1 Minerva outpost into this region controlled by one of these Skymine outposts. That's because it would cost 2 energy to cross this double line and an additional energy because there's another company's outpost in that section. But let's say, for instance, that this player chose to put these 3 station outposts in these 3 sections. This player could do that because they had 3 total energy, and each of these sections was a single line to cross. It's important to note that while spending energy and placing outposts, players can place them on their side, and the reason that they do that, players will gain bonuses for each section that they've claimed that shows a bonus. And players can lay these outposts face down one at a time as they claim these bonuses at the end of this step. That helps them keep track of what's been claimed and what is still to be claimed. Once a player spent all of the energy that they want and placed outposts onto the different sections of the moon, they can claim the rewards for each section one at a time. It's important to note that there are 2 sections on the moon board that are known as enclaves. These sections are essentially a section within a section. So for instance, a player would have to first expand into this region and then expand again into the middle of the enclave before they can claim the bonus on the inside of that section. As players claim the bonuses of each section, they'll put these outposts face down to show that they've been claimed. and the rewards for each section are different based on the symbol. Rewards showing this symbol will give a player a coin depending on the number in the middle. Rewards showing this symbol will allow the player to move up one space on the track of the company that they selected to expand for each number in the middle. So 1 space on the track for this bonus, 2 spaces for that bonus. If players see this bonus here, that would allow them to move forward on their tank track, 1 space for each number in the bonus. As players move along this tank track, they will move to different sections, and as they cross certain sections, those will be worth coins or points at the end of the game. Also, if players pass this marker right here, they'll gain this many points at the end of the game, and in addition, they'll unlock this action space right here. You can see this because they've passed this symbol on their tank track that says on. If a player were ever to reach the end of the tank track, for every bonus they get that would give them 1 movement, they would simply gain 2 coins instead. If players were to gain a bonus that has this icon, these would be research points that the player could spend. Research points would be used immediately, and they can either be used to gain coins or to buy research plans. And we'll look at that in more detail after fully explaining the rest of this action. If a player has entered into a section with another company's outpost, before gaining any bonus, they would first oust this company's outpost. So for instance, this player could oust the Skymines outpost and place it back in the Skymines section. The players can choose which column to place the outpost in, but it has to go in the lowest column available. One important note, however, is that once uncovered, these bottom sections that show 2 coins can never be covered up again. So this player would have to choose this column, but they would have to start on this space because once again, these sections can't be covered up. If, however, this column had been open, the player could have instead chosen to cover up this space, reducing that company's value by 1 coin per share. Once the opposing outpost has been removed, the player would then put their marker face down and gain the bonus like normal. Once a player has used all of their energy cards to take this action, all of the energy cards would then be flipped face down, and it would then be the next player's turn. And if a player only has 1 energy card, and the energy from that card isn't enough to enter into any sector, they would have to forfeit that energy entirely. And also, it's important to note that it doesn't matter if a section doesn't have a connection to its home station. A player could still expand that company as long as it's adjacent to one of the outposts. Now that we've looked at expanding out onto the moon, I want to cover the Research Scientist card action, but before we do that, it's important to talk about research points and how you can spend them to gain research plans. Anytime a player gains research points in the game, they can use those research points for one of 2 things. They can either exchange 1 research point per coin, as many research points as they have, or they could use those research points to buy research plans. When spending research points, you can buy research plans or gain coins in any combination. So if you have a research point left over after buying a research plan, you can gain a coin with that remaining point. Anytime a player wants to buy research plans, they can buy either a level A or B research plan for 1 research point each, or they can buy a level C research plan for 2 research points each. If a player wants to, they can also buy one of the face-up special research plans, and that would cost 2 research points. And it's important to note that the first special research plan doesn't become available until round 2. If a player buys a research plan from this far left column of any of these sections, they'll also get the coin on the supplement space. After players have acquired any research plans and spent all of the research points that they've collected on a turn by taking one of their actions, they can place their research plans on any space of their research track. But players can never place a Category A research plan on any of these spaces that show a crossed off A. So only Category B, C, or special research plans can be placed on these spaces. So for instance, this player could place this research plan right here, and if they wanted to, they could place this Category C research plan on this space. They could, of course, also just place it in the next available space right here. It's also important to note that when placing research tiles, you can place a tile over any existing research tile as long as the upload marker hasn't reached or passed it. We'll look at how to advance along this track in detail during the explanation of the next action, but as a quick explanation, research plans will show certain requirements that have to be met to be able to pass along them. So in general, grouping research plans that have the same requirements is a good idea to be able to go as far as possible on one turn. After placing any of the research tiles purchased on your research track, you would fill in any empty spaces from the appropriate stack of tiles, although any special research tiles would not be refilled. If a player decides to take the Use a Research Scientist action by playing one of these cards, they would follow these 3 steps. First, before moving their upload marker, if a player wants to, they can pay 2 Crypt Coin to flip any research plan face down. And this includes the starting research plan that the players begin the game with. The reason that a player may want to do this is a flipped down research plan has no requirements and can be moved across. So for instance, a player could flip this one down if they wanted to, and it would have no requirements to move past that research plan. It would also give no rewards if you stop there, but it would allow you to progress on the track. After players have paid and flipped any tiles they want to, they would then move their upload marker along each plan, making sure that they pass each requirement as they go. And it's important to note that players could move as far as they wanted to, as long as they can continue to meet the requirements. When checking to see if you meet the requirements of research plans, you look at the top half of the research plan. And many times these requirements refer to cards that are face up in your play area. So for instance, if a player activated this card on their turn and they still had this required resource face up, they would meet the requirement to be able to proceed on to this research plan. They could then check the next research plan to see if they meet that requirement. In this case, they do as well, so they would then move. It's also important to note that meeting resource requirements can be met by playing multiple cards. So in this example, this part of this research plan requires 3 total of this resource. The player has met that requirement by having 3 total resources of that type face up in their play area, even though it's spread among multiple cards. The other portion of this research plan requires 3 additional resources of a separate type. Since this player has unlocked this portion of their player board, they're allowed to play an extra action card, and they also have 3 resources of one type, so they also meet the other portion of that requirement. Special research plans have a requirement of paying Crypt Coin instead of having cards face up. So to be able to proceed on to this research plan, the player would have to pay 2 coins to the bank. And then finally, if the player wanted to, since they meet the requirement of this research plan as well, they could end their movement right here. It's also important to note that the player could have stopped before reaching that mark, but in general, the goal is to try and get as far as possible on this track. You can't enter empty screens of the research track. There always has to be a plan to proceed on to. And when a player stops, they would get the reward from the tile where they stopped. It's important to note that they would only get the reward where they stopped, not the tiles that they passed over along the way. So in this example, the player wouldn't get a coin here or 2 research points for passing these. They would only get the 2 coins for stopping and ending their movement on that research plan. And it is important to note that special research plans don't give a reward when you stop on them, but they do give you a bonus at the end of the game, which we'll look at during scoring. Then finally, as a third step, after you've finished moving your upload marker as far as you can or want to, you would then gain the research points listed at the bottom of the scientist card, and you can spend those to purchase research plans or gain Crypt Coins, just like when getting research points from any other action. Also, it's good to remember that if you're trying to advance along this track, you want to make sure and activate this action while these cards are still face up. If you were to use these cards on a prior turn and then try and take this action, you would no longer meet these requirements when triggering this action. So you always want to take this action while these cards are face up if there are requirements for research plans. After following these 3 steps, this card would then be turned face down, and it would be the next player's turn. Another action a player can take on their turn is to use one of their Field Scientist cards. Field Scientist cards are the only type of card that don't show up in a player's starting deck of cards, so they have to be acquired from the card display. To perform this action, a player would use one of the Field Scientist cards that might be in their player area. This Field Scientist card would allow a player to move 1 space on their tank track and then gain 2 coins. There are also 4 Field Scientist cards that relate to one of the different companies. When playing a Field Scientist card that relates to one of the companies, you would first gain 2 moves on the tank track and then 1 additional coin, and then, in addition to what you've gained above, you would also gain an additional point of movement for each 2 gas collectors controlled by the company whose card you're playing. So in this example, by playing the Field Scientist card for the Tawak Industries, this player would gain an additional movement on their tank track because they control 3 total gas collector icons. After a player completes a Field Scientist action, they would flip that card face down. and it would then be the next player's turn. The next action that a player can take on their turn would be to place a bonus marker. To take this action, the player would take one of their bonus markers from their supply, and then they would place their bonus marker on one vacant bonus space on the board to take an action. Some of the bonus spaces in the game have some type of requirement that has to be met for a player to be able to place on that spot. For instance, these bonus spaces on the top left of the board are majority bonus spaces. This bonus space can only be visited by a player if they have the most research scientists face up in their play area. And it's important to note that all of these majority spaces require having a clear lead. If you're tied for the lead, you can't place on one of these spaces. If a player is able to place their marker here and they have one research scientist face up in their play area, they would gain 2 coins from the bank. If a player has a research scientist and any other type of scientist face up, including a field scientist, they would gain 2 coins and 1 research point. And if a player has a research scientist and 2 other types of scientists, they would gain 3 coins and 2 research points. These 4 bonus majority spaces relate to resources and energy. To be able to place in one of these 4 locations, the player has to have the most of the specified type of resource face up in their play area. So in this instance, the player would have to have the most titanium. If they have 2 or more titanium face up in their play area, they would be able to move up 2 spaces on the Ostrogo track. If they have 4, they would be able to move up 3 spaces, and they would be able to remove an outpost of their choice of another company. And if they have 6 total resources face up, they would be able to move up 4 spaces on that track and gain 1 research point. All of the other resource majority spaces work in the same way, but the rewards are slightly different. For instance, for having the most energy, the player would be able to move up on this specific track and gain a coin, and if this player had 4 of this particular type of resource, they would be able to move 3 spaces up on this track and gain 1 on their tank track. If a player places on one of the 3 standard bonus spaces, there might be different requirements to be able to place there. For instance, this bonus space would give players the first player marker and give them 1 research point to spend. But a player isn't able to go to this space if they're already the first player and this is the first turn of the round. They would have to wait until a future turn to be able to go to that space. This is so that other players have a chance to get the first player marker. If a player were to go to this location, they would immediately take the first player marker and then get 1 research point. If a player were to go to this location, they would have to pay 1 coin to go there, and then they would be able to buy a card from the display using money instead of resource cards. This is the only way that a player can ever buy a card using money. A card would be taken into the player's hand just like normal. If a player goes to this location, to be able to go here, they would first have to get rid of a card from their hand permanently by placing it in the card discard pile for the main display. By taking this action, however, the player would get the value of the card plus 2 in coins. So in this example, by discarding this card, the player would gain 3 total coins by coming to this location. If a player were to come to one of these 4 spaces, these are the bonus tile spaces. To be able to go to these spaces, the players would have to pay the coins listed at the top, but then they would reserve these specific bonus tiles for the next round. These tiles aren't claimed right away, they're collected as part of next round setup. But once these tiles are collected, they either act like additional cards, or they increase the value of a resource card that you use for the round. For instance, if a player had this bonus tile on a future round, they could place it over this card to increase this card's value by 1. So for this round, this player would have 4 of this resource instead of 3. Once this card is used for the round, both the card and the tile would be flipped over. You wouldn't be able to use it on a different card. If a player collects one of these bonus tiles, they can be used just like cards of the matching type. And the nice thing about these bonus tiles is they don't take up one of these card slots. So for instance, if this player were to claim one of these 3 bonus tiles, they would get to use that tile in the following round as a card of that type, in addition to the 3 cards or 4 or 5 that they've placed, depending on if these slots are opened. A player can flip these tiles face down and use them just like a card of the corresponding type during the round to take an action. For instance, if this player had this additional energy, whenever they take the energy action, they would flip this card down and this tile and gain 4 total energy to use on their turn. The last action that a player can take on their turn would be to drop out of the action phase. When doing this, the player would first turn all of their face-down action cards below their board face up. They would then choose one of their resting decks, which in the first round will only be 1 card in each stack, and take all of those cards in the chosen deck back into their hand. They would then clean up their action area below their player board by moving each of these cards into one of the resting deck locations at the top of their player board. And if a player were to have any bonus tiles in their area, they would return those to the bottom right side of the board. Any players who have dropped out of the round are skipped on their turn for the rest of the round. Once all players have dropped out of the action phase, you would then complete preparation for the next round. The first step would be flipping over the next special research plan. Take the coin that's under the special research plan and place it in the supplement space. If there's already a coin there, just place it on top of the existing coin. As a reminder, these coins or coin are gathered whenever a player takes one of these research plans. Then any bonus tokens that are placed would be returned to the players who placed them. When returning these bonus tokens from the bonus tile spaces, the player who claimed the particular bonus tile would take that tile for the next round. Then the card display would be refilled. First, any of the cards in the rightmost column would be removed and discarded. All of the cards remaining would be shifted to the right, and then new cards would be placed from the top of the stack, going from the lowest number to the highest. After those steps are completed, the planning phase would start for the next round. After the action phase of round 7, the game would end and then final scoring would take place. Then players would score points as follows. First, they would find any card in their deck of cards that has additional share symbols for a particular company on the right side of the card. In this example, the teal player has 2 additional shares for the Minerva company. The player would first write down any cash they have on hand, so in this example 3 coins, and they would then calculate their score in each of the following 4 companies. Each company's score is calculated in the following way. A player looks to see how many coin symbols are uncovered for a particular company, so in this example 8, and they multiply that number by how many shares they have of that company. So in this example, the teal player has 5, 6, 7 total shares in Minerva Corporation, so they would gain a total of 56 points for this company. They would score each of the companies in the same way. Then they would score points for the farthest number that they've passed on both their research and their tank track. On the player's research track, if they have any special research tiles, they would add these totals to their total score. So in this example, they would gain 20 points for having passed this space and an additional 14 points for these 2 research tiles. It is important to note, however, that players would only gain these additional points from these special research tiles if their upload marker has either reached or passed these particular tiles. After adding all of these categories, the total would be the player's score. The player who has the highest total would win, and if there's a tie, the victory would be shared. The last thing I want to briefly talk about are the different company tracks, the bonuses they give, and the requirement for moving across this space in the middle. Each of the 4 company tracks has a space in the middle that shows 5 coins. To be able to progress past this space, a player has to pay 5 coins. There's an additional space near the end of the track that also costs 10 coins to pass. If a player wants to pass either of these spaces, they have to immediately pay this much money. If they can't do that, or if they don't want to do that, the player has to stop and not move across that space. Each company track will also have 2 bonus thresholds indicated by these highlighted sections down here. If a player's marker passes into one of these bonus thresholds, they then gain a permanent bonus for the rest of the game. In this example, if a player ever uses this particular type of resource to acquire a card from the display, they would have to pay 1 less total resource. If a player ever achieves this bonus threshold, they would be able to use any mix of resources when acquiring cards from the display. They wouldn't simply be able to use one type of resource when taking that action. In addition, the card's cost would be reduced by 1, so this allows players more flexibility when buying cards. If a player reaches the bonus threshold on this track, they would get to increase the total value of energy points that they spend every time they take an energy action. So for instance, every time this player takes an action to spend energy and expand out onto the board, they would get to add 2 to that total. It's important to note that for bonuses like this that provide a permanent benefit, the player would only get 1 of the bonuses. It wouldn't be cumulative. If a player passes into the bonus threshold of this track opens up 2 new bonus marker placement spaces for the player who's in this bonus threshold. If a player has achieved this bonus on their turn, they could come to this location, first paying 2 coins like indicated here, and they would then either get 2 research points and a movement on their tank track, or 2 movement on their track and 1 research point to use right away. If they achieved this bonus, they would get to do a better action for cheaper. If a player reaches one of these 2 bonus thresholds, they would also gain an additional bonus placement spot. This one would allow them to take a similar action to the bonus space on the board where they discard a card, but instead of getting an extra 2 coins for their card's discarded value, they would gain 3 extra coins. If a player goes to this bonus space, they would have to specifically discard a card showing carbon resources, but they would gain the value of that card that was discarded and an additional 8 coins. Alright everybody, that was our video. Hopefully it was helpful and hopefully it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below, or you can email me directly at thedicey@gmail.com. You can always connect with us on social media or by visiting our Board Game Geek Guild. And as always, if you find this content useful or helpful, or if you just enjoy what I'm doing, make sure and like the video and subscribe to the channel, and you can click the bell icon to make sure that you're notified whenever I release new content. Alright, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.